Welcome back, everyone, to Today Assets Report, your go-to destination for the most important news and analysis in the digital asset space. I'm your host, and today we are diving deep into something that I genuinely believe is one of the most underappreciated stories unfolding right now in the entire crypto market. We're talking about XRP, and more specifically, we're talking about the real supply shock timeline, the actual mechanics, the actual legislation, and the actual catalysts that could fundamentally change everything we know about XRP's price potential. Now, I've covered XRP for a long time, and I always try to ground these conversations in real data, real catalysts, and real timelines, not just hype. So today, that's exactly what we're going to do. Buckle up, because if you're in the XRP community or even just curious about it, this is the update you absolutely cannot afford to miss. Let's get into it right now. So let's start at the very beginning here, because before we can talk about where XRP's price could go, whether that's $100 or beyond, we have to understand what's actually driving the possibility. And the answer comes down to two massive catalysts that I've been watching very closely. The first one is a specific provision inside the Clarity Act, legislation that, if signed into law as currently written, could actually force Ripple to complete their XRP distribution plan ahead of schedule. The second catalyst flows directly from the first, and that is Ripple publicly announcing that they are done selling XRP altogether. Now, when both of these things happen, you're not just looking at a price pump, you're looking at a structural transformation of XRP's market dynamics. And that's what today's entire breakdown is about, understanding exactly how these two dominoes fall and what the timeline actually looks like when they do. Let's zero in on Section 205 of the Clarity Act, because this is the engine behind everything we're discussing today. This section establishes the criteria a blockchain must meet for its native asset to be classified as a commodity rather than a security. And one of the key requirements, this is the part that really matters, is that no single entity or group of affiliated persons can control more than 20% of the total token supply. Now, when you apply that rule to XRP and to Ripple, you immediately understand why this is such a critical piece of legislation for this community. Ripple currently holds a very significant portion of XRP, and if the Clarity Act passes and they are held to that 20% standard, they would need to distribute a substantial amount of their holdings. That is what triggers the supply shock, and that is exactly what we're going to track through the rest of this segment today. Now, here's where things get really interesting, and I want to make sure everyone understands this nuance, because it completely changes the conversation. Within the Clarity Act, there is actually a separate pathway specifically for pre-existing blockchains, and XRP absolutely qualifies for this. The XRP Ledger was created back in 2012, long before any of this legislation existed, which means Ripple can potentially use what's called the Paragraph 3 pathway. Under this lighter set of criteria, the standard isn't the strict 20% insider ownership cap. Instead, the requirement is that at least 50% of the total XRP supply must be held by persons other than the issuer, related persons, or affiliated persons. And based on current on-chain data and public information, Ripple may already meet that threshold. So does that mean the supply shock story is dead? Absolutely not. And here's why that question is so important to think through carefully. Here's the reality on the ground right now, and this is where things get genuinely exciting if you understand what you're looking at. Even if Ripple technically qualifies under the pre-existing blockchain pathway and only needs to stay below the 50% threshold, which they appear to already meet, there is still a massive piece of this puzzle that points toward XRP higher prices, and that is the rulemaking process. Once the Clarity Act is signed into law, the SEC and the CFTC will enter a formal rulemaking period. They will define exactly who counts as an affiliated person. They will define exactly how ownership thresholds are calculated. They will publish those rules, open a comment period, and then finalize everything. This process could take 12 to 18 months based on what we've seen historically with major financial legislation like Dodd-Frank. And during that window, every serious XRP investor needs to be paying very close attention. Let me give you a quick timeline so this all comes together clearly, because people have been asking me, okay, if the Clarity Act gets done, what does the actual schedule look like? So here's how I'm modeling this right now. We're running with the assumption that the bill gets passed and signed into law sometime before the congressional August recess. That kicks off the formal rulemaking process immediately. The SEC and CFTC then have approximately 360 days, roughly 1 year, to adopt rules through the notice and comment period. After final rules are published in the Federal Register, there's an additional 60-day window before those rules become effective. So if you do that math from an August signing, you're looking at the rules being fully in place somewhere in the range of late 2027 at the outside. That is the window we are working within for the supply shock story to fully develop and play out. Now let's talk about Ripple's actual XRP holdings, because the numbers here are critical and you need to understand them clearly. As of the most recent on-chain data available, Ripple currently holds approximately 32.75 billion XRP locked in escrow. Every single month, 1 billion XRP gets released from that escrow programmatically. That's just how the smart contract works. It's automatic. Historically, Ripple has been keeping around 300 million of that released XRP and returning approximately 700 million back into escrow for another 32-month lockup period. At that current pace, if Ripple needed to get their total holdings down to the 20 billion XRP mark, which is that 20% threshold of the 100 billion total supply, the math tells us they couldn't get there in 12 months at the current rate. But if they accelerated their distribution to 1 billion XRP per month instead of 300 million, they could bridge that gap in approximately 12 months. That is where the timeline and the catalysts line up perfectly. And here's the point that I want to make absolutely crystal clear, because I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, wait, if Ripple distributes 12 to 15 billion XRP over the next year, doesn't that flood the market and absolutely crush the price? And the answer is no. And this is one of the most important things to understand about how Ripple actually moves XRP. Every single sale that Ripple makes is done OTC, over the counter. That means they are selling directly to banks, financial institutions, and large-scale partners through private arrangements. None of these transactions are hitting the open retail order books. None of this is showing up on the same exchange where you and I are buying and selling XRP. So the distribution of that XRP doesn't push the price down on retail markets. It moves the supply into the hands of major institutional players while leaving the retail float essentially unchanged or even tighter than before. This is the part of the story that really doesn't get enough attention, and it's honestly shocking to me how few people outside of the XRP community have connected these dots. Think about what it actually means when Ripple completes this distribution plan and moves that XRP into the hands of global banks and financial institutions. You are not just reducing the overhang of Ripple-controlled supply, you are literally seeding the world's financial infrastructure with XRP. These are the same institutions that are going to be using XRP for cross-border payments, for liquidity provisioning, for settlement and clearing across international markets. When those institutions hold XRP because Ripple has completed its distribution, the incentive structure changes completely. You now have major financial players with a vested interest in XRP's success and a vested interest in seeing its price appreciate. That fundamentally changes the demand equation for XRP going forward. And then we arrive at the second catalyst, the one that I believe will be the real psychological turning point for this market. Once Ripple has completed their distribution plan and their holdings are down to or below that 20% threshold, they will publicly announce that they are no longer selling XRP. And when that announcement hits, everything changes. Right now, one of the single biggest objections that skeptics and critics throw at XRP is, Ripple is just going to keep selling forever. There's always going to be this giant supply overhang. Ripple will perpetually suppress the price to fund their operations. And look, I get why people think that. It's been a legitimate concern for years. But the moment Ripple says publicly, on the record, we are done, that argument evaporates completely. And the market will reprice XRP almost immediately when that happens. Now, I want to address something here because it's important to be intellectually honest about the full picture. There's a real possibility that Ripple qualifies under the pre-existing blockchain pathway and only has to meet the 50% threshold, which they may already satisfy. If that's the case, the regulatory pressure to accelerate the distribution timeline simply may not be there in the same way. Ripple could theoretically continue at their current pace of releasing and distributing XRP over a longer period without being forced to speed anything up. And that means the supply shock driven by this specific Clarity Act provision might not hit within the next 12 to 18 months on its own. But here's what I want you to hold on to. Even in that scenario, the direction of travel is exactly the same. The trend is clear. The destination is defined. The only variable is the speed of arrival. What makes this moment so uniquely powerful in XRP's history is that we are watching multiple independent forces converge at the exact same time. You have landmark legislation in the form of the Clarity Act moving through Congress with real momentum and bipartisan support. You have Ripple having already won their landmark legal battle against the SEC, establishing that XRP is not a security as a matter of law. You have a pro-crypto administration in Washington actively encouraging the development of clear digital asset regulation. You have global financial institutions increasingly integrating blockchain-based payment infrastructure. And now, on top of all of that, you have this very specific provision within the Clarity Act that directly addresses how much of any given digital asset can remain in the hands of insiders before it qualifies for the commodity classification. All of these forces are pointing in the same direction at the same time, and that is extraordinarily rare. Let's also talk about the macroeconomic backdrop here, because no asset exists in a vacuum, and XRP is no exception to that rule. We are living through a period of significant global monetary uncertainty. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency is being questioned more openly than it has been in decades. Cross-border payment systems that were built in the 1970s and 1980s are straining under the weight of modern global commerce volumes. Central banks around the world are actively exploring digital currencies and real-time settlement systems. And right in the middle of all of this sits XRP, a digital asset that was literally designed from day one to serve as a bridge currency for international value transfer. The timing of Ripple's distribution completing, combined with the regulatory clarity coming from the Clarity Act, could not be landing at a more favorable macro moment for XRP's use case to finally break through into mainstream institutional adoption. Here's the bottom line that I want every single person watching Today Assets Report today to walk away with. The XRP supply shock story is not a meme. It is not a talking point invented by pumpers to get retail investors excited. It is a mathematical and regulatory reality that is unfolding in real time through actual legislation, actual on-chain data, and actual corporate distribution schedules. The two catalysts, Ripple completing their XRP distribution plan and then publicly announcing they are done selling, are connected directly to the Clarity Act timeline. If that bill gets signed into law before August, the clock starts. And over the next 12 to 18 months, everything that the XRP community has been building toward starts to crystallize into market reality. The people who understand this story now, before it becomes headline news, are the ones who will be best positioned when the rest of the world finally catches on. And that, right there, is why we do this show every single day here at Today Assets Report. Our job is to find the signal inside the noise, to read the actual legislation, to track the on-chain data, to follow the regulatory developments, and to bring it all together in a way that actually makes sense for real people trying to make real decisions about their financial future. The XRP supply shock timeline is real, the catalysts are identifiable, the legislation is moving, and the math works. Stay locked in, keep doing your research, share this video with anyone in your circle who needs to hear this story. And as always, we'll see you in the next one right here on Today Assets Report. Take care, God bless, and stay ahead of the market.